This is St Mark's Woodcote, a traditional suburban church. Spacious inside and originally designed to accommodate 700 worshippers, it has direct access to excellent facilities, a large foyer, church office, 2 halls and a well-equipped kitchen. The vicarage is conveniently situated next door. Outside the church are well-maintained lawns and paths, a memorial garden and the Jesse Rive Hall. But St Mark's didn't always look like this. In 1903, Purley was still a village, but a village growing fast as London itself expanded. A new church was needed to cope with the spiritual needs of the growing population. In the winter of 1903-1904, a committee was formed calling itself the Provisional Committee for a New Church. On it were local dignitaries, clergy and businessmen, including 2 very wealthy landowners, Ernest Harrison, a gentleman farmer, and William Webb, an estate agent. Both men offered land for the new church, and had William Webb's offer been taken up, St Mark's would now stand on the Webb estate, south of Foxley Lane. But the site offered by Ernest Harrison on Peaks Hill won the vote. Among other advantages, it was well away from the River Bourne, with its tendency to flood. The committee moved fast, and within a year a structure known as the Iron Church was completed and dedicated in March 1905. It had been a wonderful effort of fundraising, but the Iron Church was far from ideal. It would hold only 250 people, and the need was for many more. It was too hot in summer and unpleasantly cold in winter. But the expanding congregation, ably and enthusiastically led by the first curate in charge, the Reverend Lucius Palmer Smith, was firm in its resolve. This was only a temporary arrangement, and raising funds for the new church was given maximum priority. In 1906, George Fellows Prynne, an experienced ecclesiastical architect, was appointed and plans drawn up and approved. The new church would have an imposing tower and a peal of 6 bells designed to look like this. 3 years later, on the 23rd of October 1909, and after some intense fundraising activity, the foundation stone was laid. The consecration followed just over a year later, in November 1910, and the new church of St Mark's was born. Sadly though, there was no tower or spire. Despite constant and passionate appeals from the bishop and Palmer Smith, the money had run out. But St Mark's first priest had already moved on. He had raised money from rich and poor alike. But at the end of 1909, just before the consecration of the new church, the bishop moved him to Streatham Hill, where his old church, St Margaret's, was struggling in heavy debt. His fundraising talents were needed there. St Mark's second priest was the Reverend Albert Hooper. Generous to a fault, a Hebrew specialist, rowing enthusiast, and inspirational preacher, he was much loved and greatly in demand around the diocese. His incumbency, though, was short. In 1912, Albert Hooper contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 50, leaving his widow with the sum of £4 after his debts were cleared. A book of his sermons, entitled Social Graces, was published posthumously, and there is a stained glass window in his memory in the Lady Chapel. When the Reverend George Martin arrived in 1913, it was to take charge of a lively church, short on history, but long in the expectations and ambitions of its fast-growing congregation. Officially, the church had been put on the map in 1911, when an order in council by the Bishop of Southwark created the ecclesiastical parish of St Mark's. Inside the church, the music was provided by a fine new organ, supplied in 1915 by the firm J.W. Walker. But across the English Channel, the sounds were not of music, but of bombs and bullets, as the First World War raged in France and Belgium. In the parish magazine, there was a prominent appeal for able-bodied young men to enlist. Your country needs you. Your king calls for you. it announced to all those aged under 35. And so the young men of St Mark's enlisted and went to war. The curate, Edward Evatt, went to the Western Front as a military chaplain. The vicar took 6 months' leave of absence and went to a naval base in Scotland to minister to the men of the auxiliary fleet. When, as was inevitable, bad news arrived from the front, a memorial was set up in the church. Stained glass windows were endowed by grieving families in memory of their sons. But church life went on, including the Purley Crusaders Bible class, which met in the church hall every Sunday afternoon. In 1918, when the fighting stopped, George Martin continued his capable leadership of the parish until 1922, and he can truly be called the consolidator of St Mark's early years. These then were the early priests, the pioneer and master fundraiser, the inspirational preacher, and the consolidator. In the 9 decades that followed, taking in the Second World War, the millennium in 2000, and through to the centenary in 2010, 9 more priests came to St Mark's, each bringing their own talents and sense of mission. Eric Shattuck was vicar from 1922 to 1939. These were difficult years, the years of the Great Depression and the general strike of 1926. From the pulpit and in the parish magazine, Eric Shattuck referred regularly to the issue of unemployment and to what he called the unworthy dwellings in which live so many of our countrymen. He called for the people of St Mark's to make a sacrifice of comfort and ease, and voluntarily to accept a lower standard of living. But once again, war in Europe edged closer. The leaders of the nations and their people, declared Shattuck, were coming to the edge of an abyss, looking down into it and recoiling with horror at what they saw. But it was into that abyss that Europe plunged. Eric Shattuck left St Mark's in 1939, and his successor, Alfred Raby, arrived just as the fighting began. Parish life continued in skeleton form, and the vicar's message to the congregation was that God's work must go on. Despite the early bombing and the flying bombs of 1944, several of which fell in the parish, St Mark's had an amazing escape from damage. The 50 years from the end of the Second World War in 1945 were coming-of-age years for St Mark's. An updated war memorial was unveiled and dedicated in 1948. Alfred Raby oversaw a full post-war revival of parish life, and congregations grew steadily. The Sunday school, in particular, went from strength to strength. In 1954, Raby handed over to Philip Smith, son of St Mark's first priest, and the next 10 years proved to be glory days indeed. The first stewardship campaign was introduced, a sound amplification system was installed, a tester was commissioned and installed above the altar in the Lady Chapel, and a new pulpit donated. In 1955, over 600 communicants were recorded over the Christmas services. In 1956, over 250 children were involved in Sunday school and junior church. Because of its location, St Mark's had tended to be a church for the middle and upper middle classes. This was never a significant problem, although one issue was controversial from the very beginning. This was the issue of pew rents, a system whereby parishioners could rent pews for themselves and their families in favoured parts of the church. Wealthy churchgoers saw it as a practical means of generating a regular income for the church and paying the vicar's stipend. Others were hostile, and in May 1926 an annual general meeting proposed that this church be thrown free and open to everybody, and that pew rents be abolished. The motion was defeated. Pew rents continued for another 40 years until they were finally abolished by Philip Smith in 1955. The 1960s and 1970s saw 2 more priests, Derek Blowes, a one-time Franciscan novice, and Philip Haynes. The two men were contemporaries both at Oxford and Ripon College, Cuddesdon, and in very different ways they left their mark on the parish. In 1968, under Derek Blowes, the old hall, the green corrugated iron building which had been the iron church and had given service for nearly 60 years, was demolished, and the new hall took its place at a cost of £32,000. It had been yet another magnificent effort of fundraising. Under Philip Haynes, the Scout hut was rebuilt and the sanctuary reordered with a canopy of lights. Philip Haynes was also involved in the introduction of the controversial alternative service book. Socially, the 1970s were probably the most active time ever at St Mark's. There was a drama group and concerts in the church. There were pie and punch parties, youth club discos, May balls, New Year's Eve dinner dances, barn dances, whist drives, parish picnics, fundraising bazaars and garden parties, all run by an active social functions committee. Many of the congregation were professional people working in the city, used to high-powered meetings and making things happen. In 1973, there were 24 nominations for 18 places on the PCC, and adjudicators had to be appointed. The Reverend Peter Sills, who arrived as vicar in 1993, recalls his first impressions of St Mark's people.
I think the thing which really sticks in my mind about St Mark's is a sense of energy. This is a sort of can-do area, and it's full up with can-do people. And you had this sort of tremendous sense that anything was possible. I remember, I think very shortly after I came, there was a discussion about putting a second floor on the church hall, and 2 days later the plans appeared. So I thought, gosh, this is not the normal run of parishes. And then alongside that, there was, what I remember particularly, there was an openness. And before I came here, I spoke to one of the former curates, and he said, yes, St Mark's, he says, a telegraph reading congregation that likes a Guardian sermon. And that, I think, was just the best description. And I remembered that. And so there was a lot of lay leadership, which I appreciated, and I loved the space of the church, and the community was very welcoming. So I had good memories. It was a good place for me. I learned quite a lot.
As for its style of worship, whether high church or low church, plain worship or so-called popery, St Mark's had always been something of a mixed-up kid. From the beginning, the early priests had ongoing battles with William Webb and others over the form of worship. William Webb, whose father had been a Bible teacher in the Church Lads Brigade, was totally against anything resembling Anglo-Catholicism. Lights on the altar and bowing towards the holy table were definitely not wanted at St Mark's. But William Webb eventually lost his battle for a plain worship, low church St Mark's. He moved away from the parish and died in 1930. Despite the many conflicts, he had been a generous and hard-working servant to the church, and there is a window in his memory in the south aisle. Over the years, the vicars brought to St Mark's their own style of churchmanship, mostly without incident, but some changes did generate controversy in the congregation. The issue of matins, or the morning prayer service from the traditional Book of Common Prayer, was an example. On the one side were the traditionalists, who felt that matins represented the norm of Christian worship. On the other were those who saw the service of Holy Communion as the proper central act of Christian worship. Congregations were divided, and priest after priest appealed for unity. Another controversial issue was the use of an altar positioned in the nave, as opposed to using the high altar at the far east end of the church. Philip Smith began nave altar celebration in 1960, but after he left it fell into disuse. Roderick Gibbs resurrected it in 1986, not though to everyone's liking. Gibbs, who wanted St Mark's to go higher church in its style of worship, caused more controversy when, at the main Sunday service, the psalm between the Old and New Testament lessons was discontinued, as was the offertory hymn, it being considered a hiccup in the flow of the service. Roderick Gibbs, who arrived at St Mark's in 1983, came from an Anglo-Catholic background, with its accent on the sacraments and the daily Mass. He had trained at the famous College of the Resurrection at Mirfield, and was genuinely shocked at the suggestion that not every Sunday should include a service of Holy Communion. Roderick Gibbs' legacy is still felt at St Mark's. He was angered by social inequality and racism, and Bishop Trevor Huddleston, famous for his anti-apartheid activism, was invited to preach. He was responsible for 2 parish mission campaigns, Renewal 87 and Focus 91, the latter resulting in the formation of house groups which are still in place today. Described as a hard taskmaster, but having a tangible depth of faith, Roderick Gibbs shook up St Mark's in many ways, but as Heather Rhodes, parish deacon at the time, subsequently wrote, both Roderick and St Mark's grew from their 10-year encounter with each other. He dug fresh soil and planted well, and his work continues. Peter Sills, who followed Roderick Gibbs in 1993, took charge of the parish up to the millennium in 2000. As well as a deacon, St Mark's at this time was blessed with the services of 4 readers. Use of the nave altar became the norm. New-style modern vestments arrived, and once a year, on the Feast of the Epiphany, incense was used. Peter Sills replaced the standard all-purpose service books with a series of individual booklets providing special liturgies for both the main festivals and the liturgical seasons. Most memorably, he brought a new style to the highlight of the church year, the days running up to Easter, known as Holy Week. But how important did Peter Sills rate this part of his ministry?
Oh yes. When I left, I said, if I'm remembered for anything, I'd like to be remembered for Holy Week. Holy Week, as you know, is the central point of the Christian year. And too often people come on Palm Sunday and then they come again on Easter Day and they miss out what's going on in between. And it's very difficult, I think, in terms of faith and in the journey of the week to move from one from the other. So after a few years, I hit on the idea of doing a Holy Week pilgrimage, where we would have a themed series of services during the whole week, from Palm Sunday to Easter Day. And I think I probably did that over about 4 or 5 years. And it was a very moving experience. The first time we did it, I was just astonished. And I think the first night were about 30 people. By the time we got to Good Friday, there were 80. Now, 80 people in church on a Good Friday is astonishing. You might think that that's how it ought to be, which indeed is the case, but too often it isn't. And so Holy Week became an important part, and I invited people to come and do it, and I think the last one I did myself, because my last Sunday here was actually Easter Day in the year 2000.
Peter Sills left St Mark's in 2000 to become residentiary canon at Ely Cathedral. No story of St Mark's is complete without mention of St Swithin's, its daughter church in Purley. In 1926, when Eric Shattuck was vicar, the diocese decreed that another church was needed to serve the rapidly expanding community between Purley Knoll and Smitham Downs. A site in Grovelands Road was selected, and in 1929 the foundation stone of a temporary church was laid, the Bishop of Woolwich presiding, and the Scouts and Guides from St Mark's forming a guard of honour. The foundation stone of the permanent church was laid in 1939, 6 weeks before war was declared, but work had to stop when the fighting began. It was not until 1954 that St Swithin's was completed and dedicated by the Bishop of Southwark. Since that time, the two churches have enjoyed close contact, and for many years there was a joint parish magazine. It had been Eric Shattuck's vision that there should be one Christian unit, the parish of St Mark's with St Swithin's, and in 2005 his dream was realised. St Mark's and St Swithin's were united into a joint benefice with a shared priest. It fell to the Reverend John Peyton, who had arrived at St Mark's in 2001, to implement this challenging task. Despite the historical closeness of the two churches, they had always had their own churchmanship, their own councils and committees, finances, and most importantly, their own priests. This was now to change, and John Peyton was asked what challenges he remembers.
They were, and I imagine still are, two very different parishes. And there was obviously a lot of anxiety amongst both congregations about what might happen. I think we agreed as a first step what we had to ensure throughout the whole of this process was that the jewels in the crown that either parish had would be preserved and would be there to continue to be developed as time went on. So I think that was the first challenge that we faced together, and I think we managed to do that fairly well. There were things to do with making sure that service times could be properly synchronized and that they would gel, and we had various exercises that we undertook to make sure that happened. I don't think we felt really that that went quite as well as it might have done, but clearly that was work in progress, and I imagine is continuing to be worked out still now. Whether we would have done things in the way we did, looking back, I'm not sure, but I think we made a good enough start.
John Peyton came to St Mark's from being successor at Southwark Cathedral. He arrived at a time when both churches, in common with the Church of England in general, were experiencing diminishing congregations, and the average age of the faithful was increasing remorselessly. He took on the task with enthusiasm and good heart, and his musical gifts soon became apparent to both congregations. Incense was used more often at St Mark's, and the church bell rung at Holy Communion. The choir flourished. He encouraged links with local schools, was made governor of Wilson's Grammar School and Woodcote Primary, and chaplain to the lodge at St David's. He enthusiastically supported the uniformed groups. The youth room was converted into a parish office and the flagpole restored. John Peyton looked after the flag personally, setting it to half-mast when someone died. He will be remembered not least for his preaching, particularly at baptisms, when he would walk round the church delivering his sermon to an uncomplaining infant in his arms. In 2005, St Mark's celebrated the centennial of the Iron Church, founded by the pioneers in 1905. John Peyton left St Mark's in 2007 to become precentor of Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford. Who would succeed him? Who would carry on the work of bringing the two parishes together? And who would pick up the baton of the centenary events of the new church in 2010, with deadlines fast approaching? The answer came in 2008 with the arrival of the Reverend Franny Long, St Mark's 12th priest and the first woman after a long line of men. How did she feel about this?
If I'm being absolutely honest, I didn't even think about it, except for when I stood behind the board, in front of the board. I was very conscious of a long line of men then coming before me, my predecessors, and quite highly academic and acclaimed, and who'd gone on to achieve quite a lot. So I think perhaps that is more my thoughts when I arrived, rather than I was the first female priest. I have encountered in my time feelings against women as priests, so I wasn't unfamiliar with that, and it was at the back of my mind. And certainly at the other church, some families did leave because I was the woman appointed. But standing here, it didn't really figure greatly in my thinking.
Franny Long set about the challenges of the two parishes with energy and purpose. The work of implementing the joint benefice with St Swithin's continued to be a major work in progress. Caring and committed, She gave of herself sacrificially wherever she was needed in the two parishes. But looming ever closer was that centenary year. Who would preside and preach? How many people would the church actually hold? And who would be on the guest list? What form would the centenary celebrations take? All these and many other questions needed answers, and Franny Long remembers the time well.
It was a very busy year. A lot of people wanted to get on board with new ideas, doing things both within the church and reaching out into the community here at Woodcote. There were a lot of people who were very willing to help in the background and enough people to steer the projects that we decided. We had a very rough idea 6 months before of the sort of things we wanted to achieve, to celebrate worship here, to celebrate the music here. And I think one of the things which I remember mostly is the fact that halfway through the year I realised with some sense of shame that we hadn't had any specific days of prayer here, this being a centre of prayer. So we then set up a day of prayer when the church was open for silent prayer for people to come in. There were people here all day, not as many as I would have hoped, but certainly throughout the year prayer did figure in most of the occasions we had here.
And the St Matthew Passion play here, what are your memories of that?
That was deeply moving. It was a personal challenge for myself because I believed in the choir, I'd sung with the choir, and I was very keen to have them here. There was there was slight resistance because of the cost of putting it on, but we had some donations to help us with that. And certainly I think everybody who was here would say it was a truly memorable evening and very moving. And to fill such a place with music, which is so part of its tradition, it seemed such an appropriate celebration in such a special year, really.
The centenary service took place on November the 7th, 2010, St Mark's Bathurst. It was happy, resplendent and full. Clergy and members of congregations, past and present, crammed together in the pews, as did the grandchildren of William Webb, one of St Mark's original founders. And, most fittingly, the Very Reverend Graham Smith, Dean of Norwich Cathedral, grandson of Lucius Palmer Smith, St Mark's first vicar, and son of Philip Smith, the sixth vicar, came to preside and preach. 100 years of a building is nothing within the span of eternity, he said. But when it comes to people, individuals, clergy, congregations, 100 years contains such richness that we should not only take note of it, but use it as a springboard for all that shall be. Recalling his grandfather's favourite description of St Mark's as a house of prayer, Graham Smith quoted from T.S. Eliot's poem Little Gidding. "You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid." The service ended with the choir singing from Haydn's oratorio, The Creation. The composer gave his all to this work, written when he was 65, and many regarded as his masterpiece. "I was never so devout as when I was at work on The Creation," Haydn said. "I fell on my knees each day and begged God to give me the strength to finish the work." The work of St Mark's Church, Lucius Palmer Smith's House of Prayer, founded in 1905, will always be unfinished. It is indeed a place where prayer has been valid. It is a springboard for all that shall be. May its choir still be singing in centenaries to come.